Welcome. My name is Gustaf Arrhenius. I'm the director of the Institute for Future Studies and a professor of practical philosophy. I have today with me Janine Wedel, university professor at George Mason University, and very well known for her extensive research on the state of affairs in Eastern Europe and Russia. And we are going to talk about, of course, the current situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Janine, very welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be speaking with you.
So I should also mention that Janine is, of course, a researcher at the Institute for Future Studies, where she's doing historical research regarding the development in Eastern Europe. But tell me more. Tell us a little bit about your background. What kind of research have you done regarding Ukraine and Russia? What have you done, and what is your current research there?
Yes, so I am a social anthropologist, and I started my career many years ago in Poland, which of course was a Soviet satellite Eastern Bloc country in the 1980s, and I wrote about life as it actually was under communism. In other words, the informal, this very sophisticated informal system that Poles had developed over many years to study, to survive, and to sometimes to even to thrive. And then when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, I started going to the former Soviet Union. Well, it was still the Soviet Union, but then when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the very end of 1991, I started going to Ukraine and to Russia. And so I have actually been going to Ukraine since the early 1990s, and many of my contacts stem from that period. As we know, it's the largest country in Europe by area, so very significant geopolitically. It's crucial in terms of current events, in terms of what is happening today, and indeed the Second World War was fought largely or substantially on Ukrainian soil. So I've been going there since early 1990s, and in 2015, 2016, I spent an entire year there under a Fulbright fellowship. See my mug here. And I taught at Kyiv-Mohyla University, which is one of the major universities in Ukraine, located in Kyiv, the capital city. And that was, so 2000, if you think back to 2015, 2016, that is not so long after 2014. And what happened in 2014? Well, that was when the Ukrainians had a public uprising known as the Revolution of Dignity, or the Maidan, M-A-I-D-A-N. That is the public square in Kiev where the demonstrations, the protests for weeks took place. And what were they protesting? Well, the event that triggered the protests, the triggering event, was that the Yanukovych wanted to sign an agreement.
Yanukovych, he was then the president of Ukraine.
Yes, so Yanukovych, of course, Viktor Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine at the time. So the precipitating event was that he wanted to sign this agreement with Russia about trade, that they would join the Russian trade union. But the majority of the population did not want to do that. They wanted to sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which would have drawn Ukraine more into the West, which is exactly what most of the population wanted to do. Subsequent to the protests, President Yanukovych was removed, and he fled to Russia. He escaped to Russia. And then the people already knew that he was a kleptocrat, and that he had amassed huge resources and so on. And that even more of that was exposed, that he was squirreling away in foreign bank accounts and using for his palaces and so on. So he escapes to Russia. Then the Russians invade and annex Crimea, and they send separatists that are backed and funded and at least to some extent directed by Russia to populate and to take over certain eastern regions, Luhansk and so on, to actually take them over. This Donetsk area, which is the industrial base of Ukraine, the biggest industrial base. So I arrived 2015-16 after that. And what do I experience in 2015? I live downtown in Kiev, not far from the Maidan. Nearby, there are permanent and growing street exhibitions that have the faces of soldiers and volunteers who have been killed fighting the Russians in the East. Everywhere, the cathedrals have pictures of soldiers who have fallen in the East. It is an ongoing, low-level war, and you see the signs of it most everywhere.
It's interesting. So, I mean, rather than there was, so to speak, a war mode. I mean, there was a current war and it was going on, a little bit less intensive, but it was going on. At the same time, the impression is that many people in Ukraine, including the current president, didn't believe there would be an invasion this time. And that's so hard for me to square. So could you shed any light on that?
Sure. So I saw this quite closely because I was in touch with people in Kiev and other parts of the country right up until right before the invasion, and they didn't think there would be an invasion. People in Kiev,
same with me.
We don't think this is going to happen. But there were people in the Ukrainian government who did think it would happen, who did believe the American intelligence on this. And as it turns out, the American intelligence was right on and very accurate, and did believe it, and were making and made some preparations. So I think there are two things going on. I think one is that people thought, apparently people even who around Putin, there's some intelligence saying that even people around Putin, except for the closest, very few closest people, thought that the intervention would be limited to the Donbass. It would be limited to these areas that already had a strong Russian presence and had already been taken over, and then they would just be expanded. The conflicts would be expanded. The occupied territory would be expanded by the Russian army. So there were people apparently even not far from Putin who thought that was the case. they knew something would happen, but they didn't think it would be this massive invasion. But I think from the point of view of Ukrainians, it's or anybody who one day is sitting at a cafe and life is going on as normal, and meeting friends and going to work and carrying on as we all do on some level, despite bad things going on around us and bad news. I think it was just unimaginable. And also a fantastical idea, because if you know anything about Ukraine, you know that there is this very long legacy of Ukrainian resistance and Ukrainian identity and opposition to Russia. And you know that this is that Russia, that the czars, not only the czars, but then of course the Soviet government did its best to oppress and put down Ukrainians, not the least of which was what Ukrainians call the Holodomor, which was the enforced starvation and famine, which was genocide against the Ukrainian people. 4 million, upwards of 4 million Ukrainians are estimated to have perished during this forced collectivization starvation period. And so there's a long, and Ukrainians have been specifically targeted and they have resisted. And there's a long list of things that makes Ukraine different from Russia. And so if you know that from a Ukrainian point of view, if you know even basic things about Ukraine and the background and public culture, it's kind of a fantastical idea that Russians would think that they could actually control the country, to invade and actually have a successful occupation, right? So that there wouldn't be, snipers and sabotage every day, all the time, trying to undermine the occupiers. So I think that's another element, that it just seems so ill-advised. And what we're seeing is, not surprisingly, what we're seeing is this resistance coming back in full scale. I mean, one of the key Russian propaganda points is that Ukrainians have no history or culture or identity, which is a common way of dehumanizing people. But this could not be further from the truth. And in fact, unlike Russia, Ukraine has this robust tradition of civil society, and we're seeing this now.
Yeah, so they have this, but then let me ask you. So they have this vibrant culture, but still, if you look at the development of Ukraine from 1990 up to now, economically, it has been rather dismal. Why is that?
Ukraine has had a very difficult has had a very difficult path, because it's wedged between Russia and the West. It hasn't, fully been able to be integrated into the West. And we've had this system of oligarchs that developed in Ukraine as it did in Russia, which I can talk about in a minute. But think about the war in the invasion of eastern Ukraine in 2014. That is the end. Donetsk is in, besides being a lovely city, was a whole area. Donetsk Oblast, Donetsk region is the industrial base. So if you want to tank an economy, if you want to completely destroy an economy, or substantially, you target the industrial base. Now, of course, Ukraine has a robust IT sector and that sort of thing, but that was the area that was targeted.
Yeah,
Um,
no, yeah, because I did read some fantastic, very important things about the natural resources in Ukraine are amazing, and some of the natural resources, like for example, neon. I saw that 90% of the import to United States semiconductor industry came from Ukraine, but actually from eastern Ukraine, exactly the region you're talking about. So that, of course, must have been a big blow when that area was taken over by Russia. So say, but we could get into that because they did also have this same problem, which is your specialty. Same problem at Russia, that they have this so-called oligarchs. What is an oligarch? Maybe we should explain what an oligarch is.
well, yes, and they're often described in the West as rich, simply, super wealthy businessmen. But in fact, the oligarchs, both in Russia and Ukraine, became oligarchs within a very, very short period of time. So, in the Ukrainian and the Russian, in the post Soviet context, these people are not just super wealthy billionaires. They got their wealth by being close to people who were in the state structures or being part of state structures. So imagine a huge economy that was the Soviet Union, that full of mineral and all kinds of resources, crown jewels of minerals, and who acquired them? So everything was owned by the state. Everything was owned by the state. So so after the fall of the Soviet Union, the major project by by the countries that were the successor countries and by the West was to privatize, to put all this wealth in private hands and create a market economy. Well, there are lots of ways of doing this, but the way that it was done, and it was done without putting first legal and legal mechanism, without first creating a rule of law that would support a market structure. So if you think about the West, how did market economies develop? Well, they developed in conjunction with laws that would, with the whole infrastructure of market economies. And of course there were, it didn't just happen overnight. There were a lot of emendations, a lot of changes, and so on. And it wasn't always a pretty picture, to say the least. Well, what happened was that this was very, very rapid, and people who were insiders to the process, who had the right connections or developed them at the right time and took advantages of opportunities, became very rich and overnight.
They didn't become rich because they were very skilled businessmen. They became rich because they could put their hands on these natural resources because they were, so to say, very close to the political powers at the time. So they basically
Or
just grabbed.
they were synonymous with the political. They were integrated with the political power, and there's synergy between politics and economics and finance that came about. There was no separation, little separation between the state and politics and business. Those were all intertwined. And so that's where the oligarchs came from in 2004, 5, 6 is where we begin to see we see the rise of these super wealthy people, and at the same time that the populations are impoverished. And this is at the same time that the oligarchs came to be. So that's the legacy of the oligarchs. And in Russia and in Ukraine, what you had in the 1990s were competing clans, what I call the clan states. And when the term clan, when people in the region use the term clan. It doesn't have, it's not, it has a family connotation, but these are not family connections per se. So a clan in that context has its feet both in the state and in private enterprise, and it uses state resources in order to achieve its private ends, in order to acquire wealth. So in both countries, we had this system of competing clans in the 90s. Then that changed under Putin in the 2000s. Today, there are still competing clans in Ukraine. In Russia, there's only one group, and that is security. That's the security group, and that's Putin's base is the FSB, the former KGB. Yeah. That is his base. That is the only power.
So sometimes people have this. You see it mentioned sometimes in Western mass media. This hope that since the war is going badly, that the oligarchs would in some way get rid of Putin. But that's perhaps then is based on a misunderstanding, because there are no competing oligarchs to Putin. It's just Putin and his group of oligarchs.
That's absolutely the way. I mean, that's the way I see it. Starting in the 2000s, Putin began to consolidate power, and the oligarchs all had their all were enablers. They were all helpers in this enterprise.
Jumping to just one other person, because there's been a little bit about him in the press recently, because he jumped ship. Anatoly Shubai, who was, I guess, one of the main architects of the privatization that you talked about earlier, privatization of property in the 90s. I mean, he didn't have any top position, but it was still Russia's climate envoy, and I guess on good terms with Putin. But he now have jumped ship.
Yeah, so I've been following Anatoly Chubais since the 1990s, because I studied privatization in Russia and how these processes took, these waves of privatization, these policies of privatization took place, and I also studied the role of Westerners, of Western advisors, who were actually far more than advisors in some of these activities. So Chubais and his group, sometimes, when I talked earlier about the competing clans in Russia and in Ukraine, so there was something called the Chubais clan. That was one of the 4 or so clans that analysts talked about in the 1990s in Russia. And what was Chubais's clans? What was its key resource? Well, its key resource was its access to hundreds of, thousands of dollars, millions of dollars from the West. At that time, they were this group of people, almost nearly all from St. Petersburg Mafia, some called them, which were responsible for the privatization and the economic reforms that took place at that time.
He was President Yeltsin's key economic.
He was a key economic person throughout the 1990s, and he was a darling of the West. And in fact, if you read the mainstream Western press, it was all about this young, enlightened, westward-leaning circle of reformers, of which Chubais was the key person, very close to Larry Summers, who was became Secretary of the Treasury in the United States, very close to the IMF, very good relations with the International Monetary Fund and other Western organizations in financial institutions, very close to Harvard University, and advisors who were key people in this story as well. So Chubais, so he is the head of this Chubais clan, and that has, of course, key positions in the Russian state, as well as key positions, formal and informal, outside of the Russian state. And what were they doing? They were creating a system, really, of kleptocracy. So that was what was going on while he was being touted in the West as this young, enlightened Western reformer that we can work with. So what does this young, enlightened, westward-leaning reformer that we can work with do in the 2000s? Well, first of all, he has to approve, he and his people had to approve Putin. Under Putin, he took the top jobs in big state corporations. So he was chair of the, starting already in 1998, he was chair of something called United Energy Systems, which was Russia's electricity monopoly. So, and that put him squarely at the center of the nation's economic life. In 2008, he became head of the state-run Russian corporation of nanotechnologies. So another hugely powerful government post. So 2008, he was also, interestingly, named to the International Council of J.P. Morgan Chase. So that's just one little, the J.P. Morgan Chase, one little indication of his international reach. So my point is that this my first point here is that this young reformer actually shows his true colors in working all these years with Putin, as Putin is rising to power and becoming more and more aggressive, more and more egregious. I mean, we've got the wars in Chechnya, the war in Georgia that Putin started. We have the war in Syria. We have the poisonings in London. We have the murders of journalists, and so on and so on, and the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And Chubais stands by all of this.
And yeah, you could tell me a bit more about that, because you said that in Ukraine there were still, and still is, competing clans of oligarchs. It's not like in Russia, where Putin and his group have taken all of the control. There is more a multipolarized, so say, in Ukraine. And I guess that might also have implication what's going to happen after this war, and depending how the war goes.
So there are several competing clans in the form of people. One could point to Akhmetov, Pinchuk, Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky is an oligarch who helped fund Zelensky. As I understand it, President Zelensky rose. That was part of his power base. It also didn't hurt that this show, Servant of the People, featuring Zelensky, was on prime time every night after the evening news. You would see Zelensky as president performing for the audience, for a prime time audience. So this is the kind of simulacra that was created here, and that many have argued helped him get elected. So, but there is there are various personal power centers in Ukraine, and Ukraine is a democracy. Of course, one would hope that this system could change and become more equalized. But in terms of what these oligarchs will be doing after the after the war. Of course, it depends on the outcome of the war. My hope is that the Ukrainians will be able to be victorious in some sense. And then I'm sure we will be seeing them both publicly and behind the scenes trying to bolster their images by taking on all kinds of public projects, of rebuilding projects. It seems to me that will be one of the key issues, is going to be rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding cities that have been demolished, key places that have key historical sites that have been taken down. So that will be that's my guess about what they will do, and my guess is that it will also be a big opportunity for them to make even bigger reputations in the West because of all these activities. And it will be important to remember that, like those oligarchs in Russia, these people are not clean. In order to be, you don't become and maintain your status as an oligarch and continue to acquire wealth without also being linked to organized crime. It's not just about having stolen from the state resources. It's also about actively continuing to keep these resources. And that involves, not necessarily out there doing the thuggery yourself, but that involves collaboration with people who do.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that will be if Ukraine succeeds in defending itself, or at least getting some kind of negotiated peace with still an independent state. That will be a challenge then in rebuilding Ukraine from this horrible war. That there is this power structure that, of course, is lurking in the background, and might not be very, very. It's going to be a problem how you're going to do that. And they had this budding democracy, and one worries how that will survive this onslaught. And of course, that might also have been one of Putin's aim, that whatever Ukraine he leaves after this war is going to be a Ukraine in deep trouble.
I think that's right. I do think there'll be lots of money from the West to rebuild, and the challenge will be to spend this money wisely and not do the same not so helpful and actually quite unhelpful things that were done in Russia after the end of the Soviet Union, in privatization and bringing in the big six consulting firms and bringing in all manner of groups, mainly bolstering their own salaries and their own perks without actually a lot of, in many cases, not really helping set up what the structures that were needed at the time. So that's going to be a big challenge. Another huge challenge is the displacement of population. We now have an estimated up to 1/4 of Ukrainians who are outside the country.
Delmi and some researchers from the Institute for Future Study just released a report, which is also a bit worrisome in this respect, namely that 12 million Ukrainians wanted to leave the country before the war. They want to leave. So one wonders how many of these people are going to return. And that, of course, is going to be an enormous brain drain for Ukraine to deal with. If people already 12 million want to leave before the war, and now, of course, because of the war, we have this enormous amount leaving, and now the latest estimates that 10 million people will actually leave.
Well, so yes, and they've been experiencing this brain drain now for decades, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's important to remember that Ukraine has a very high education level, the math and science are first rate. As I said, the IT industry has been thriving. I mean, very high level of education. A Ukrainian colleague that I saw yesterday was complaining, who's just now arrived in Washington. She was saying that her son is in the best school in Washington, D.C., where I am today, and he's in the best school, and they're still a year behind in math from what her son was learning in Ukraine. And I would have said, based on what I know, probably even 2 years behind typically. So yeah, so this has been a problem for years for Ukraine, and it will be a challenge going forward. But the gender dimension will play a role, because remember, now the men are not being allowed to leave between the ages of 18 and yeah. And now that's when the war ends. Presumably that would change, especially if the wives have been successfully resettled elsewhere. So that could well be is likely to be a huge challenge going forward.
That is a very good place to end this conversation, but I will ask another question, a last question, more speculative question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why did Putin start this war?
He does have one huge aim that I think we do understand, or we should understand, based on his actions since he has risen to power and continued to consolidate power. And that is his desire to recreate the Russian sphere of influence that the czars and under the Soviet Union. He has an expressed desire, and he's been writing this, and he's been saying this quite openly now for years.
Acting on it very clearly.
And he has been acting on it very clearly, and the West hasn't effectively pushed back. And a key reason the West hasn't effectively pushed back is because the Russian institutions and because of what we call the enabling industry, which helped all these the financiers, the offshore people, the people who can help, lawyers who help with tax evasion, because this ill-gotten money has become so integrated into the Western system, and people have become so dependent on having this money and using this money, and in fact, key Western institutions have been embedded with this money, that it hasn't been in the interests of many people in the West to push back against Putin. So we have a lot of work to do in the West to prevent this from happening in the future, and to clean up our own practices and our own ethics and our own societies.
On that point, I would like to thank you, Janine, for taking the time to speak to me about this. And certainly, I mean, this terrible development and this terrible war just makes your research even more important. So I'm very happy that we had time to speak to you, and we will indeed speak to you more. I hope you will soon also give a talk about this at the Institute. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.